Hello, everyone. So I am Olivier Duchene, trying to say it like the American way. I'm PhD at the Israel institution, so I'm newly hired associate professor over there. I'm doing research about cancer. As you can see on this slide, there is two, one from Israel, one from the University of Jean-Blou. So you can consider this presentation come from both of our faculties. We are working a lot together. And I'm going to speak about yields, nitrogen requirements, and also weed regulation. So I had to choose among topics. So just this picture, so you know, we also have some studies about roots, and we checked there are roots underground for sure. But let's talk about this later. So as an introduction, just to say that in Western European countries, we are like really committed to produce small grains. That's something we know how to do, and we are producing a lot of small grains. And you can see with the size of circle and the numbers in it, the average yields for winter wheat. And so it is really normal for French farmer, for example, just to try having more than 7 tons of grains per hectare, and even more than 8 tons of grains per hectare. So we need to be really enthusiastic to go and talk with them and try, okay, maybe let's do it let's try to have 1 ton of grain with cancer. But for sure, we are really enthusiastic, and we are talking a lot about this multifunctionality goal with this kind of cropping system. So yeah, the idea is how can we try to improve this cropping system and try to have much more things than just one crop production. So we are not trying to have perennial grain or cancer for many years, but just at least try to finish it and have it for 2, maybe 4 years within the crop rotation, and see if we can answer, like broadly, these 3 main questions. Can we have, with perennial grains, some kind of improvement of the whole agroecosystem functioning? So not just grain yields, but all those ecosystem services we are looking for. The second question is about how to manage this cancer thing to be sure we have the optimal grain yields. And the third question is what kind of food chain we will use to be sure we are valorizing these grain yields finally. One more thing is, with this kind of study, we are trying, of course, each time we have an experiment to look at what are the outputs, the services we finally get, like food, feed production, how the soil is protected and so on. But also each time we are trying to have this closer look to what are the plant functional traits actually working to get this kind of output at the end. Meaning that we are trying, when we can, to understand why perennial grains are so great. Not just because they are perennial, we have many different kind of crops that are perennials or grasses, but what are really the plant functional traits that are acting to get, I don't know, more carbon storage and stuff like this. And of course, all of this is largely influenced by how you will manage your field. So we have 2 ways of doing research about cancer. The first one is we have like the normal one, academic one. We have 3 main research facilities, stations and fields. So the first one with ISARA in Lyon, France. The second one at the INRAE station of Clermont-Ferrand, that's the National Research Institute for Agronomy in France. And then we are working a lot with the University of Jean-Blou in Belgium. And after that, we have also this farmer network that are actually growing cancer. And the idea is to also gather as much as we can of observations and experience from farmers that are growing cancer to try to combine the data from research and from farmers. All of our research actually is founded by these 2 programs. So the first one is called NAPERDIV. It's a European research program. And so we some agronomy research with this program, but also a lot of ecological study and how are we improving biodiversity within cancer fields. And so we have France, Germany, Austria, Belgium, Poland, Romania, and Sweden. I think the website will be online very soon, so you can check for this. And the other program is just a French one. If I try to translate it, it would be something like perennial grains for an agroecological transition of cropping systems. So that's with IDARA, INRA, Arvalis, a technical institute, and also a seed company called Secobra Research. So let's look at some key results. So the idea with this presentation was not to talk like much about the methodology, but really some key results to see how is it going in France and Belgium about producing some Kernza. So let's talk about yields. So on this slide, and I will talk much more about the results from the research fields. And at some point, I will tell you, I will use also this farmer network to try to have a bit more observations to tell. So you have 3 sites here, and you have the green yields in the y-axis. And on the x-axis, you have the first year of production, the second, the third, and the fourth. And not surprisingly, you can see that we did manage to have some really good grain yields the first year, maybe the second year, and then you have this strong decline. Maybe the numbers on those plots are a bit overestimated because of the methodology we use, like harvesting in quadrats, not with machines. And so let's say we have this raw potential of maybe 1 ton of grains per hectare, like the first or maybe second year of production, and then it's going down to 400, 700 kilograms of grains per hectare. So strong decline. But still, maybe I have a solution if you are looking at yield persistence and longevity. You just need to have some plots with very low yields. And actually, the yield is quite steady. So that may be a bad news, maybe a good news, I don't know. But that means that the Kernza crop is actually able to produce fertility levels for years and years and years, like for 4 years in this case. So now we just need to understand a bit more about how, having these really high grain yields for years. Just one more thing is that all of those sites are under kind of low input context, so no nitrogen application in fall, and only 50 kilograms of nitrogen at spring. Which is kind of a very low input context if you compare to other cropping systems in France for small grain and winter wheat. There are some systems with like 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare with winter wheat. And this is about the total biomass production. So you have the same 3 sites combined, and you have the total biomass production at fall during crop heading, flowering, and harvest. And you can see that basically the first year of production is always the lowest biomass. And then during the following years, we actually have this increase of biomass. And for the second, third, and fourth growing season, the biomass was quite similar during fall and crop heading. But for the flowering stage and crop harvest, actually the second growing season was really the best. We have this highest biomass production. And if you look at the number, it's more than 10 tons of dry matter per hectare, sometimes even that reach 15 tons of dry matter per hectare, which is huge and really a good news for some farmers in our place who are really thinking at some feed autonomy and forage production during summer. That was really good. And even the third or fourth growing season, you can see that even if we had this decline of biomass production, it's still around 10 tons of dry matter per hectare, which is kind of still really good. Still low input context. Now, if I take the same results, but I just combine the biomass production in the x-axis and the grain yield in the y-axis, and just put some density curve on the side of the graph, and that's something we discussed with farmer. Actually, if you are looking at these dual-use crops, in our situations, clearly the second year was the one you are looking for if you want both the very high biomass production and also a good grain yields. So maybe the second one was something to talk about this crop, but something we need maybe to push a bit forward to be sure. So now let's talk about one really huge and major plant traits. So we know that this harvest index with this crop is lower than if you compare with winter wheat, for example. But I would say that maybe the more important is not that it is a bit lower, or even more, yeah, like real lower, but this harvest index is highly variable, which is something that is really a big issue, at least in our context, the way we are trying to grow it. And because that means that you don't know, even for the first, second, or third year, what kind of split you will have between the reproductive and vegetative growth and biomass. So the idea in terms of both genetics, physiological aspects, agronomy, ecological aspects, how can we be a bit more sure about how we will manage and try to understand at what point I will finally get some reproductive effort or vegetative biomass. Sorry. So still the same data, biomass in the x-axis and green yields in the y-axis. And you can actually see with the red points, which are from the first growing season, and all of the blue points are from the second, third, and fourth growing season, that the correlation between biomass production and green yields is really different between those years. And during the first growing season, you have actually a really good predictor of grain yields with your biomass, but then it's not working very well. So here there is, again, still there is much room to do research about how we can understand with the perennial grass, how do I get reproductive biomass production? And I mean, I think this question is big and still unsolved for many, many perennial grasses, and not only Kernza. Just if I try with 1 year of data from this farmers network, so no the research fields anymore, but just this farmer network. And if I put the same plot with the biomass in the x-axis and grain yield in the y-axis, you can see that the trend is still really okay, and that confirmed what we just saw before. But something interesting is that you can see that the line. Let's go. Let's see the product. Continue. Oh, you can see that the line does not cross 0 in the x-axis, which is something not really usual if you are working with winter wheat, for example. And that's a huge consequence of this, is that the less you have biomass, the lower you will have your harvest index. So that's one reason why it is so variable. And also that means maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing, but that also means that there is at a point some trade-off between this perennial biomass that is not made to support grain yields and some kind of biomass which is there to support grain yields. So yeah. And of course, there are also some other reasons you can lower your harvest index. For example, with those points, there are situations with huge spring flush of vegetative tillers, so you get biomass but not grain yields, or also some points where we had some disease issue, so again, biomass but not grain yields. Now, let's talk a bit, like really quickly about grain yields components, so that come from the work of Laura Fagnan, who's doing a really nice PhD thesis at the University of Jean Blou. And you can see different yields component, and with green arrows that positive correlation, and the red arrows are negative correlation, and you can see how strong the correlation is. And that's something you will already find in literature. The best thing to get green yields actually is just to be sure you have some spikes in fields. And of course, those spikes will participate to have a good grain density in your fields. And quite surprisingly, we were not able to find any significant correlation between the 1000 kernel weight and the grain yields. But still, if you look at the plot with the grain density in the y-axis and grain yield in the x-axis, you can see there is a set of points just below the line, and points came from the first growing season. And if you look at this graph, that means that for the same amount of grains during the first year of, you can actually have better grain yields if you compare with the second, third, fourth growing season. And here there's some compensation effect, for example, with the 1,000 kernel weight. So now again, from this farmer network who are growing Kernza, it's not like a big study with many, many statistics, but still we can say that all situations during the first growing season where grain yields was equal or better than 900 kilograms of grains per hectare, all had accumulated sufficient growing degree day before winter time, sorry. So you can see that it's well aligned with what Jake said before. And the quality of sowing was really something really determinant and important. Like, we really need now to have farmers that are capable of taking care properly of the sowing operation, which is really much more tricky than with winter wheat, for example. But also all these situations produced a minimum of 350 spikes per meter square with contrasted plant density. And even some situations were able to have really good grain yields with only 50 plants per meter square. So that means that just talking about grain yields, we don't really need to go for 200 plants per meter square. That's completely useless for a Kernza plant, apparently. Yeah, so I'm done with yields things. Now I'll talk a bit more about the nitrogen requirement of the plant, and you will see that we'll try to connect with what Jake said before. So to look at nitrogen requirement, and again with the PhD of thesis of Laura Fagnan, we have tried to look at the nitrogen concentration in the plant tissue. So we use this concept of the critical nitrogen dilution curve. And so the idea, like in theory, is just you have crops or grasses, and during the growing season, so from the very early growth to the flowering, you are going to accumulate biomass. And more you accumulate biomass, less you will have nitrogen concentration in your plant tissue for many reasons, including the fact that you will have much more biomass for stems with less nitrogen concentration than leaves. So you will get some kind of curve which is going down during the growing season. And the critical nitrogen concentration is defined here as a minimal concentration to allow the maximum growth rate. So when you have this critical nitrogen concentration, you are supposed to be on this curve, and your nitrogen nutrition index is equal 1, meaning that that's perfect and top. But if you have too much nitrogen in your system, then you will have your nitrogen nutrition index above 1, meaning that you have really good nitrogen concentration in your plant, but you are not getting more biomass. And you have the reverse. If you don't have enough nitrogen, you have this nitrogen nutrition index below 1, and you are losing some biomass production. So the idea was to try to get this curve for Kernza, and that's what we did. So there was one experiment there with nitrogen fertilization practices, and so many points during 2019, 2020, and 2021. And so we used different nitrogen fertilization practices, and the idea was to separate the point where the plant was stressed and the point where the plant was unstressed, and to define statistically this dilution curve at the optimal nitrogen concentration. Meaning that when you are on the curve, you have the perfect point with the maximum biomass accumulation, but with the minimum nitrogen concentration. And so we calibrated this curve, and then we had some points to validate the work, and actually it works really well. And of course, this work is not enough by itself. The idea is then to compare with other crops and see how it goes. And quite surprisingly, and you can think also about the forage quality. We know that Kernza is really good forage quality at early spring, and then during summer it's kind of a good forage, but really less qualitative one, and that's all to do with that. So you can see the really solid black curve is Kernza. So you have your nitrogen concentration in the y-axis and the dilution process with the biomass accumulation, and is much lower than what you are supposed to get with C3 crop and C4 crop. And surprisingly, it was kind of similar to what is found in literature about miscanthus. So there are many hypotheses to explain that. The first one, first good question is how this crop is about nitrogen use efficiency. And I have no clear answer about that, but that's a good question. But I think maybe one way to look at this like properly is just to ask about this stem to leaves ratio. And this crop apparently would have some different stems to leaves ratio if you compare to winter wheat or winter rye or some other crops like that. And also something I think we should maybe look into in more details is what about this nitrogen recycling through below ground organs. That's a perennial. And we had this nitrogen content measurement during 2019, 2020, and 2021. You can see the total nitrogen content in the plant during the growing season. And surprisingly, you can see that at some point, we are losing nitrogen in the plant. So maybe it's because of some tillers or leaf senescence, but maybe it's also because nitrogen is going to the roots. And if we don't know, this nitrogen maybe will be used again next year for the next growing season. Maybe it's going, I don't know, to feed the soil food network through root exudates, but that's clearly a good question if you are trying to understand what would be the global nitrogen cycling process with this kind of crop. So when we did that, then we asked, okay, what would be the really great nitrogen fertilization practices with this crop? And you will see that this is something like really, really well aligned, I think, with what Jake said before. But again, we try to use crop modeling to extend our knowledge from the experimental sites. So what we did is we used through a multi-stimulation process, and that was the work of Pierre Aubry during his master thesis. He gathered 23 years of climatic data sets, so past climatic data sets for the model. And then he decided to try to have these fertilization practices with 3 fractions. So you can have your fertilization in early spring, mid-spring, or in fall, and either with 0, 25, 50, 75, or 100 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. So if I remember something, 95 different management option you have just because of these different nitrogen fertilization practices. And then you have to combine this with all the climatic data sets. And finally, you got something like 11,500 simulations. And you have many, many results. You know, that's crop modeling. So how then you have to deal with that? So the idea is just to look at, just to answer the question, what would be the best fertilization practices? The idea was to say, okay, we want the greatest mean grain yields, but also we want a high probability to achieve yields greater than the average, meaning that you are looking for a distribution of results with the right negative skewness, So on the right side of the picture, that's exactly the kind of distribution you are looking for, okay? Average and if possible, a high probability to have more than the average. And if I just jump to the final result, actually, the most negative skewness from this work of Pierre Aubry was with 75 kilograms of nitrogen during spring, early spring, and 25 kilograms of nitrogen during fall. And clearly there is something about nitrogen during fall. I mean, that's a perennial. We need to have some tillers production during fall. Of course, maybe we need to think really a bit more about how to optimize this fall application of nitrogen. And the average yield was around 1 ton of grain per hectare. That's not really surprising because our data are showing this. So of course, they are kind of providing the same kind of potential. Just one thing, the average yield obtained with this fractioning, 75 in spring and 25 in fall, was only 47 kilograms of grain less than if you put 300 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. Meaning that there is kind of no point to try to have much more nitrogen application to optimize your grain yields. That's not how the plant is working, at least right now. So maybe we'll have a bit more biomass, or I don't know, but that's at the risk of having much more maybe leaching or in your system and really better grain yields. Okay. Last topic, weed regulation. So I know with perennial grains, there is a lot of expectation that we will finally have some kind of natural weed control. And that's true for sure at some point, but here is the situation, at least with our sites, the three I just presented before. So that's the weed biomass, total weed biomass at fall, again for 3 sites, at fall, crop heading, flowering, harvest. So you can see that during fall, along between the first, second, third, and fourth growing season, we finally have some kind of weed control, maybe because of soil cover, but also because no tillage practices and so on. But if you look at this weed biomass during crop heading, I mean, there is a lot of weeds over there. And the weed biomass is steady and remains over years. So no weed control at all. And yeah, the biomass was kind of the same during crop heading or flowering. But another thing is that during crop harvest, you can see that there is kind of no weeds anymore. So if you just look at this data with the harvest, I can say that Kernza is really well suited to control the weeds, but because during spring, actually all the weeds were capable of doing their entire growth cycle before we get this Kernza harvest stage. So Kernza in our situation is much more later than our regular annual wheat or even our weeds. So, but still there is actually some control effect I will show you. But yeah, I mean, Jake already presented it, but there is this phenology called traits about Kernza, and you have your growing degree days in the x-axis and how the crop is developing on the y-axis with the BBCH scale. So basically it's how the phenological is improving with your crop. And you can see that actually Kernza is kind of the same growth rate after stem elongation. But before stem elongation, we have this slower growth rate. And that was because of some phyllochrones issue, a bit slower. Also this vernalization requirement, but not so different as you have for wheat, but because also of this photoperiodism effect. And that's, our work about phenology. We have tried to model how the phenological process of Kernza is working. And because of this effect, we were able to measure this delay between like you are supposed to get with winter wheat and what you actually are getting with Kernza. So basically that means, again, in our situation, that if you are going like with the x-axis and you have your day after emergence, after sowing, after harvest, whatever, and in the y-axis you have your daily growing degree day, you can see that, okay, you have some growing degree days every day. And the vertical dotted line is when you have your vernalization requirement fulfilled for your Kernza. And the gray part of the plot is when the reproductive effort of Kernza is actually undergoing. So that means you actually have your biomass accumulation like for real and with competitiveness. And in our situation, that means that, you have this growing degree day in early spring that are not well valorized by your crop, but they are completely available for weeds. That's why we had such initial weed pressure, and because then we did not use any weeding techniques, mechanical or chemical, then this initial weed pressure just remain over years. But we have this shift in weed communities. So we talked a bit previously about this shift from annual to perennials, which was the case in our section, but the most significant shift was from having broadleaf species to grass species. So you can see 3 sites, and yeah, kind of the evolution from year 1 or 2 to year 3 and 4. And you can see the traits we measured about how it is, and see that at year 3 or 4, clearly the broadleaf species just almost disappeared, like for most of them. And finally, we have much more grass perennials, and also maybe a kind of improvement in earliness of our weed communities. So think about this Kernza a bit later, and weed communities that are going to be a bit with earliness improvement. So finally, you have something kind of complementary, and you are not clearly able to control weeds because they are really working well with Kernza actually. So just a thought, but it's not as bad. Because as Jay mentioned, the Zim paper, and this is actually exactly the same in this study, the weeds were not seen as a bad thing for grain yield. There is no injury in the grain yields. But that's a kind of diversity, plant diversity in our fields. We are really great maybe to attract some pollinators, some, I don't know, store carbon. And we have in some results, really good results with the organic farming, because of all weeds you can find over there are actually the best systems to try to think about plant diversity in your field. So I'm not saying that you want weeds, I'm just that you need to integrate this in your mind. So, and here is the part maybe less funny, because on the farmers network, we have almost half situations that we are not able to produce grains during the first year because of this weed competition, too many in the fields. So we need to work really more about can we control weed and have the system to be sure weed will be controlled. But also I wanted to underline that it's maybe not only about the lack of weed competitiveness, but clearly, at least in France, we have really lack of experience about growing intermediate weed grass. And that's kind of funny because when I went to talk with farmers that are really used to grow seeds, they are producers of grass seeds, they are kind of perfectly aware of how to manage this kind of growth. And these experiments, farmer experiments, were not really that are used to grow grass seeds, but like more winter or even corn and stuff. Now some ongoing and future work. So for the future, for sure we are continuing to have some good work with the food, feed quality and use, and actually there are some papers ongoing about seed forage quality along the growing season. We are also going to study a bit more about the yields from different Kernza breeding cycles. Also going with a new experiment about the water and nutrient use if Kernza plus cover cropping plus intercropping and different intercropping. And maybe Valentin just mentioned, the idea for us is not just to try to have it intercrop legume, but also with different kind of legume, like fast growing legume, slow growing legumes, also some graces to see even complementarity between two graces. We have tried to own beer also, like 100% beer. That was, we are not able to sell it, so we had to drink it like owned by ourselves. But just for fun, that was kind of a nice beer. Maybe we will try again, I don't know. Also about field management, you just seen this farmer work ongoing, and the idea, we have this master student at Ivao, she's actually trying to have this work, working with farmers, gathering farmers into workshop and try to think and try to co-design their new innovative cropping system, and how can we build new knowledge about such radical things. And that's kind of the way we are trying to work at IDARA, whatever the topic. How can we do research like academics, and how can we do with farmers? That's really the way we are working. So future work about also intercropping, and this work we are trying to do with Correde at Madison University. So we will have this replicate experiment about what is the optimal plant density to be sure you have the optimal grain yields from year 1, 2, and 3. And finally, something I'm really happy about that, because that's my thing. We are starting this study about studying below ground and above ground plant traits. And not only about grain yields and green yields component, but the leaf traits, stem traits, root traits, because there is, this kind of increasing topic about functional ecology and how we can use plant traits as a good proxy to estimate ecosystem services in fields. And so the idea is to see how can we understand this plant trait with Kenza and compare with other races that we are in France or in context. And the idea also is to look at different intermediate with growth accessions. So from the Land Institute, different breeding cycles, but also accessions from, let's say, wild intermediate with grass from Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, I think, Eastern Russia, just to see maybe if we can still look at some domestication influence on different plant traits. But maybe we have no idea about how relevant it is now, because the domestication is still new, so we will see. And finally, here is a picture of Kenza with white clover. So we are trying to have some research about intercropping. And I really want to thank the University of Jean Blou and all my partners and staff in fields. They are really they are very happy to work with Kenza. You can see a little smile on her face. And that's kind of new thing for us, and everyone is always surprised to go in a Kenza field. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share some really first results with you.